Major Werner Plusket had been staring at the English Channel for 4 years. Not because he wanted to, because it was his job. As commander of the 1st Battalion of the 352nd Artillery Regiment, he was positioned at Widderstand's Nest 62, a concrete observation bunker sunk into the bluffs overlooking what the Allies would codename Omaha Beach. He had spent hundreds of nights scanning the same gray water, calculating the same firing solutions, listening to the same silence. By the pre-dawn hours of June 6th, 1944, the sea was still choppy from the storm that had battered the Normandy coast for 2 days straight. The German Meteorological Service had just reconfirmed weather completely unsuitable for an amphibious landing. No invasion possible for at least several more days, probably a week. Plusket knew this. His commanders knew this. The entire German command structure in the West had been told this. And so, sometime around first light, around 5:15 in the morning by some accounts, with his binoculars raised more out of habit than expectation, Werner Plusket swept the horizon one more time. The horizon was no longer empty. Through the scattering morning mist, ships were filling the sea, ships of every size and description casually maneuvering back and forth as though they had been there for hours. There appeared to be thousands of them. Cornelius Ryan, who interviewed Plusket extensively for his 1959 book, The Longest Day, the most comprehensive oral history of June 6th ever assembled, reconstructed the moment in detail. He writes that Plusket stared in frozen disbelief, speechless, moved as he had never been before in his life. In those first moments, Ryan records Plusket saying he knew, calmly and surely, that this was the end for Germany. He grabbed the telephone and reached the duty officer at 352nd Division headquarters. The officer was Major Bloch. "Bloch," Plusket said, "it's the invasion. There must be 10,000 ships out there." Bloch's reply has passed into the permanent record of the Second World War. "Get hold of yourself, Plusket. The Americans and the British don't have that many ships. Nobody has that many ships." After a brief pause, Bloch asked, "Where are they heading?" "Straight for me," Plusket said. "Think about what those words document. Not a tactical miscommunication, not a gap in intelligence, a perfect, compressed snapshot of the entire German command failure, delivered over a single telephone call before a single American soldier had touched the sand. The man with the binoculars reporting what he could see, accurately. The man on the telephone filtering it through what 4 years of institutional conditioning had told him was possible. The fleet was there. The evidence was real. The words were right. The system could not receive them. This is the forensic audit of the morning. Germany lost D-Day, not on the beaches, but in the telephone calls, not in the bunkers, but in the minds of the men receiving the reports from the bunkers. To understand why no one believed Plusket, we need to go back 4 years. To the moment Germany built the cage, it would eventually lock itself inside. Part 1. The fortress that talked too much. Here is what Germany told its soldiers in the spring of 1944. It told them, "You are standing behind the most powerful defensive barrier in the history of warfare, the Atlantic Wall, a chain of concrete and steel stretching from the Norwegian fjords all the way to the Spanish border. More than 3,000 miles of fortified coastline, bristling with guns, laced with minefields, impenetrable." That is what the propaganda posters showed. That is what the newsreels told the people back home in Germany. That is what the radio broadcasts repeated, week after week, in the confident tone of a power that has already won. Here is what those soldiers could see with their own eyes. Unmanned stretches of coastline, bunkers with walls left half-finished because the cement trucks stopped arriving. Minefields with gaps so obvious that local farmers still use the same paths through them they had always used. Gun positions with weapons pointed in the wrong direction because the gun crews had not received targeting updates. A line that was, in many places between its strong points, defended by one man with a rifle and a prayer. The gap between those two realities, what Germany said and what Germany's soldiers could see, is where the story of June 6th actually begins. Not because the soldiers were wrong to be there, but because it meant that when the evidence arrived, they had already been conditioned to distrust their own observations over the official version. When Plusket called headquarters with the most accurate battlefield report in the history of the war, he was filtered through a system that had spent 4 years teaching itself to believe the wall was invincible. And invincible things don't fall. German war industry in 1944 was already bleeding dry. The Eastern Front consumed everything: men, steel, fuel, concrete. Italy was a slow, grinding drain. The Allied strategic bombing campaign was systematically destroying German production capacity. The Wehrmacht could not produce enough material to actually fortify 3,000 miles of coastline to the standard the propaganda promised. Strong points existed around the major ports, around the river mouths, at certain commanding positions on the cliffs. But between those strong points, the Atlantic Wall was a name applied to a patchwork. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had understood this when Hitler dispatched him in late 1943 to assess the Western defenses. Rommel arrived and found something closer to a press release than a fortification. He immediately began a frantic program of improvement. Millions of mines ordered, tens of thousands of stakes and obstacles driven into the beaches, new gun emplacements, reinforced concrete poured around the clock. His men nicknamed the anti-landing obstacles they hammered into the wet sand Rommel's Pargol, Rommel's asparagus. But Rommel was operating on a specific and urgent military logic that his superiors either could not grasp or refused to accept. He had fought the British in North Africa. He had watched Allied air power obliterate German armored columns in the open desert. He understood, with the certainty of a man who had personally experienced the consequences of Allied air supremacy, that any German reinforcements moving to a contested beach in broad daylight would be destroyed before they arrived, which meant the defense had to be on the beach itself, which meant every tank, every gun, every man had to be as close to the water as possible, ready to engage the first wave before it found its footing. His superiors disagreed. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, wanted deep reserves, hold the panzers back, let the Allies land, identify their main effort, then crush them with a concentrated armored counterattack. Both arguments had merit. Hitler typically resolved the disagreement by doing both and achieving neither. Some panzer divisions went to Rommel near the coast, others stayed in reserve, and none of the reserve panzers, the ones that might have reached Normandy in time to matter, could be moved without Hitler's personal authorization. File that detail away. It will surface at the worst possible moment. Now here is the piece of this story that most history lessons never teach. The piece that, once you know it, makes the events of June 6th feel not just tragic, but specifically, precisely inevitable. Allied intelligence in the spring of 1944 had carefully mapped the German order of battle along the Normandy coast. They knew about the 716th Infantry Division, an understrength, largely static unit of older men, leavened with Eastern European conscripts, manning the bunkers above what would become Omaha Beach. They had built their entire assault plan around fighting this formation. The 1st Infantry Division and the 29th Infantry Division, two of the best fighting formations in the United States Army, were considered more than adequate to overcome what the intelligence showed was a second-rate garrison force. What Allied intelligence did not know was that in March 1944, the 352nd Infantry Division, a full-strength, well-trained formation built around veterans of the Eastern Front, had quietly moved from the area around St. Lo to take up positions directly behind those same beaches. The 352nd had 9 infantry battalions. It had been running tactical exercises along the exact terrain the Americans were about to assault. Its guns were pre-ranged to cover every meter of the beach below, and it appeared on not a single Allied intelligence map. According to accounts collected by historians, the reason the 352nd's repositioning stayed secret may have been as simple as a German soldier shooting down a carrier pigeon carrying a French resistance message to London, a message that contained the 352nd's new coastal posting. One soldier, one bird, thousands of dead Americans on a beach they thought was lightly defended. The Americans landing at Omaha were planning for a garrison. They were about to meet veterans. And the men in the bunkers above that beach, Werner Pluskat and his artillery battalion, the grenadiers of the 916th Regiment, the machine gun crews in the concrete pillboxes, had no idea that their own intelligence service had failed just as completely as the Allies, just in a different direction. They didn't know that the fleet forming over the horizon represented something their headquarters had dismissed as impossible. They didn't know that the phone call Pluscat was about to make would be the most accurate intelligence report of the morning, and the least believed. What they did know was that it was dark and cold, and the sea was still rough, and somewhere in the Norman countryside behind them, Allied paratroopers were fighting their way through hedgerows, and Major Werner Pluscat, 31 years old, veteran of the Eastern Front, had his dog, a German shepherd named Harras, sleeping in the bunker behind him while he raised his binoculars for one last sweep before dawn. The man who would answer his call had already decided what he was going to see. Part 2. The Night No One Wanted to Believe. It began at 9:15 p.m. on June 5th. That was when Lieutenant Colonel Helmuth Meyer, the senior intelligence officer of the German 15th Army, intercepted a BBC radio broadcast and recognized what he was hearing. The BBC, as part of its nightly transmissions to French resistance networks, broadcast coded messages. To most listeners, they were gibberish, odd phrases, fragments of poetry, domestic announcements in no particular order. But certain messages had been prearranged as signals. 2 lines from a poem by Paul Verlaine had a specific, agreed meaning. The first line, "Long sobs of autumn violins," meant the invasion was coming within 2 weeks. The second line, "Wound my heart with a monotonous languor," meant it was coming within 48 hours. Action imminent. At 9:15 p.m. on June 5th, Meyer heard the second line. He knew exactly what it meant. He immediately alerted his commanding officer, who put the 15th Army, positioned at the Pas de Calais, guarding what German intelligence was certain was the real invasion coast, on full alert. Here is the problem. The 15th Army was guarding the wrong beach. The alert did travel upward through the chain of command. The 7th Army, the one actually defending Normandy, received it, but the 7th Army's response was measured. The storm had only partially subsided. The Meteorological Service had confirmed no invasion was feasible under these sea conditions. The Verlaine signal was noted. A heightened state of readiness was issued to some units. But the full invasion alert, the one that would have moved armor, scrambled every reserve, put every man on every beach at absolute combat readiness, never came. Because every piece of logic that Germany had built its western defense around said, Normandy makes no sense as the invasion site. Even with a warning signal, the filter held. Picture what that means in practical terms. You receive a prearranged warning signal that your enemy has agreed means invasion within 48 hours. Your response is measured, because the warning doesn't fit what you believe about where the invasion will come. That is not incompetence. That is what happens when an intelligence apparatus has been so thoroughly deceived about one thing that it cannot process correct information about another. Operation Fortitude, the Allied deception plan, had done something far more dangerous than planting false information in German files. It had made Germany's own reasoning process the weapon. In the early morning hours of June 6th, the first reports of parachute landings began arriving at German command posts. Paratroopers near Sainte-Mère-Église on the Cotentin Peninsula, paratroopers east of the Orne River near Renville, paratroopers south of Carentan. Phone lines across Normandy began to light up with confused, fragmentary reports of scattered American and British soldiers in the fields and hedgerows. At 1:11 a.m., General Max Pemsel, Chief of Staff of the 7th Army, had accumulated enough reports to understand that something massive was happening. He reached Army Group B headquarters where General Hans Speidel was in command. Speidel was standing in for his boss. His boss was not there. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the one man who had argued consistently and passionately that the first 24 hours were Germany's only realistic window to stop an invasion, had left France 2 evenings before. The storm had convinced him the invasion was days away at minimum. He was driving home to Herrlingen, Germany, to celebrate his wife Lucy's birthday, and to visit Hitler at Berchtesgaden to argue, one more time, for more panzer divisions positioned close to the coast. The man whose entire defensive philosophy was built on being present and ready for the first hours of the invasion was in a staff car in Germany when the fleet was crossing the channel. When Pemsel reached Speidel at 1:11 a.m. and laid out what he was seeing, he said, and this is documented in his post-war testimony, clearly and directly, "I'm convinced this is the large-scale operation." He was told to wait and see. Speidel's assessment was that the parachute drops were probably a raid, or the preliminary moves of a diversionary operation connected to the expected Calais landing. This might be the opening act. The main event was still coming, probably at Calais, probably in the next few days. Pemsel pushed back. The evidence, as he read it, was not ambiguous. He said his piece. The system heard it and classified it as excessive concern from a cautious staff officer. While that telephone debate was playing out, something was happening in a Norman courtyard that captures more about German readiness that night than any intelligence report. General Edgar Feuchtinger commanded the 21st Panzer Division, the only German armored formation within range of the invasion beaches. His tanks were fueled and ready. His officers were awake. The sounds of aircraft and explosions had been reverberating through the countryside for hours. Any experienced combat soldier could read the scale of what was happening. The 21st Panzer was the one formation that might have disrupted the Allied airborne units while they were still scattered in the dark fields before they had consolidated their drop zones and secured the bridges they needed. Feuchtinger could not move. The 21st Panzer was under Army Group B, Rommel's command. Moving without authorization from Army Group B was an offense against the command structure, and Rommel was in Germany. So every request to move went to Speidel, and Speidel's answer was to wait and see. The panzers that had been positioned specifically to respond to an invasion sat in a courtyard, engines idling, while the battle they had been built for was unfolding 30 kilometers away. Now consider what else was happening simultaneously. General Friedrich Dollmann, commanding the 7th Army, had scheduled a Kriegsspiel, a formal command post war game exercise, for the morning of June 6th. The exercise scenario: an Allied amphibious landing in Normandy. The senior divisional and corps commanders of his entire army had been ordered to travel to Rennes, in Brittany, to simulate a response to the invasion of the very beaches being invaded at that moment. Several of them were on the road when the paratroopers were dropping. When the reports started coming in, some of these officers had to turn their cars around and drive back through the Norman night to reach commands that were already under attack. The German army was rehearsing D-Day on the morning of D-Day, 60 kilometers from the sea. And then there's the man who was asleep. Adolf Hitler had taken his usual sedative the night of June 5th. His personal physicians and inner circle operated under standing orders. The Führer was not to be disturbed except in an absolute confirmed emergency. Reports were reaching OKW, the German High Command, through the night. Parachutists, then fleet sightings, then landing reports from multiple beaches. Each one was processed through the same assumption. This is the Normandy diversion we have been anticipating. The real attack at Calais is still coming. Do not overreact. Do not wake him. The man who had personally retained authorization over Germany's strategic panzer reserves, the armored formations that were Germany's only realistic instrument for a decisive counterattack, was asleep. His senior operations officer, General Alfred Jodl, reportedly told officers requesting release of the reserve panzers that morning with a phrase that would become one of the defining sentences of the entire campaign: "The Führer has not yet made a decision." That sentence, "The Führer has not yet made a decision," was repeated, in effect, at multiple levels of the German command structure through the morning of June 6, 1944. Hitler was briefed around noon, by which point the words "Normandy diversion" had become something between a bad joke and a catastrophe. This is the system that Werner Pluskat was about to call at first light. A system in which the man with the correct information was at the bottom, the man with the authority was asleep at the top, and every level in between was filtered through 4 years of institutional certainty about where the real invasion was going to land. When Pluskat picked up the telephone and said there must be 10,000 ships, it was not a failure of communication. It was the system working exactly as it had been built to work, and it had been built to fail at precisely this moment. Karl Wegner was 19 years old when he wrote home to his mother in May 1944. He was a corporal in the 716th Infantry Division. the unit that was supposed to be the only German formation on those bluffs above Omaha. What he wrote was not heroic. It was honest. He knew exactly how much concrete was missing from the wall the newspapers called indestructible. He would be dead within 48 hours of D-Day. Men like Wegner deserved to be remembered not as footnotes, but as people who saw clearly, wrote down what they saw, and paid the full price for being right at the wrong level of command. If this account has given voice to one of them, hit the like button. It costs nothing. It keeps these stories visible a little longer. And for the men who were there, that matters. Part 3. Straight for me. Werner Pluskett described what happened to Cornelius Ryan in post-war interviews, and Ryan reconstructed the sequence with the precision that has made The Longest Day the definitive oral account of June 6th. The words are documented. The timeline is confirmed. Pluskett had been in the bunker at WN 62 for hours by the time first light began to break. He was cold. He was isolated. He had made calls to higher headquarters and received answers that told him, in the calibrated language of the military bureaucracy, that nothing decisive was happening. The paratroopers in the countryside behind him were a raid or a diversion. There were reports of ships, but nothing conclusive. Stand by. Wait and see. At some point in the early morning hours, he decided to take one last sweep of the horizon before the light improved. Ryan describes the moment this way. Pluskett wearily swung the glasses over to the left, picked up the dark mass of the Cherbourg Peninsula, and began another slow sweep of the horizon. He reached the dead center of the bay. The glasses stopped moving. Through the scattering mist, the horizon was filling with ships. Ships of every size and description, as Ryan writes, casually maneuvering back and forth as though they had been there for hours. There appeared to be thousands of them. It was, in Ryan's words, a ghostly armada that had somehow appeared from nowhere. Ryan records Pluskett's own account of his internal state in that moment. He stared in frozen disbelief, speechless, moved as he had never been before in his life. And then, in those first few seconds of looking at the largest naval force in the history of warfare bearing down on his position, he knew, calmly and surely, that this was the end for Germany. Not panic, not hysteria, a calculation. The trained professional, looking at what was in front of him and doing the arithmetic, he reached for the telephone. He called divisional headquarters. Major Block answered. "Block?" Pluskett said. "It's the invasion. There must be 10,000 ships out there." "Get hold of yourself, Pluskett," Block replied. "The Americans and the British don't have that many ships. Nobody has that many ships." There was a pause. Then, "Where are they heading?" "Straight for me," Pluskett said. Those 3 words, straight for me, are the entire forensic verdict of D-Day, compressed into a phone call. The man with the binoculars did everything right. He was in position, he was alert, he reported accurately. He used clear, unambiguous language. He was told he was wrong. And then the fleet arrived anyway, exactly as he had described. Pluskett was not the only one making calls like this. Along the entire Normandy coast, from the base of the Cotentin Peninsula to the mouth of the Orne River, German forward observers were picking up their phones and having nearly identical conversations. Multiple sources, independent positions, consistent reports. The sea is full of ships, more than we were told was possible. They are heading for the beaches. Each report traveled up the chain and met the same filter. This cannot be the main invasion. This cannot be the scale we are hearing. Something in these reports must be wrong, because the reports could not all be wrong, because the fleet was real, and because the filter was built not to protect the truth, but to protect the belief. Consider the position of General Erich Marx on the morning of June 6, 1944. Marx commanded the 84th Army Corps, the formation directly responsible for the defense of the Normandy beaches. He walked with a wooden prosthetic leg. Soviet artillery had taken the real one in Ukraine in June 1941, when he was commanding the 101st Infantry Division. He had survived that wound and returned to active duty when he could have taken a comfortable posting away from the front. He was, by the assessment of the officers who served under him, one of the sharper military minds in the German order of battle. He was also, notably, one of the very few senior German commanders who had actually argued. against the consensus of his colleagues, that the Allies might land in Normandy rather than Calais. He had been largely ignored on that point. On June 6, 1944, Erich Marcks turned 53 years old. He had been called back from the war game in Rennes and arrived at his command post in St. Lo as the naval bombardment was reaching full intensity. He looked at the situation map. His corps was being attacked on multiple beaches simultaneously by forces that the reports, even filtered as they were, indicated were far larger than any defensive plan had anticipated. His only armored division was immobilized. His infantry reserves were being chewed up in the wrong direction, chasing parachutists that may or may not have landed where the report said they did. And above his command post, the sky was filling with Allied aircraft in numbers that made the Luftwaffe's absence not just a tactical problem, but an insult to the concept of military balance. He was a professional soldier. He assessed what was in front of him with the cold precision of a man who had been thinking about this exact scenario for months and had argued, unsuccessfully, for the preparations that might have made it manageable. Then he started issuing orders. The National World War II Museum's account of the German response to D-Day describes Marcks as one of the first German generals to react without delay. He wanted the 21st Panzer to move toward the beaches immediately. But the 21st Panzer was still under Army Group B, still waiting for the authorization that now had to go through Speidel, who had to reach Rommel, who was in Germany. By the time those authorizations began to travel through the chain, the window that Rommel had identified as Germany's only realistic opportunity had already closed. Down on the beaches, the battle was already turning. For a period of hours on the morning of June 6th, Germany was winning on Omaha Beach. The men of the 352nd Infantry Division, the veterans who appeared on no Allied intelligence map, the soldiers who weren't supposed to be there, were performing exactly what Rommel's doctrine required. Their weapons had been pre-ranged to every meter of the sand below. When the American landing craft dropped their ramps, the machine guns opened fire into men who had not yet reached solid ground. 27 of 32 DD tanks, the amphibious Shermans meant to give the infantry armored support, had flooded and sunk in the rough seas 6,000 yards from shore. The infantry hit Omaha without armor. They waded through chest-deep water in the channel, carrying weapons and equipment weighing 60 pounds or more into the converging fields of fire of the most effectively positioned defensive system on the entire invasion coast. Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment landed at Dog Green Sector and ceased to exist as a functional combat unit in approximately 10 minutes. 5 of the 6 landing craft that carried this company to shore dropped their ramps directly in front of German machine gun positions. The V Corps battle report, filed at 8:30 a.m. on June 6th, read in part, "Enemy fire prevents crossing of the beach. Elements of German ammunition being relayed. Gunners." Imagine being in one of those bunkers at 8 a.m. on June 6th. The beach below you is covered in American soldiers who cannot advance. Your machine guns are working. Your artillery is firing. Every report from your own position says the defense is holding. You might actually believe, for those few hours, that this is working. But the man with the binoculars, the man who had said 10,000 ships and been told to get hold of himself, was looking past the beach. He was looking at the horizon, and the horizon, 3 hours after he had first seen it, still showed the same thing. The fleet, undiminished, growing. Allied destroyers, watching the slaughter on Omaha from offshore, made a decision that no doctrine authorized and that their hulls were never designed to survive. They steamed directly toward the beach, some closed to within 800 yards of the shoreline, scraping their keels on sandbars, their captains risking grounding their ships on hostile coast. They turned their 5-inch guns directly on the German concrete bunkers at nearly point-blank range. This improvised, unplanned, unauthorized direct naval fire support began systematically destroying the fortifications that the morning's pre-landing bombardment had failed to neutralize. It was not in any operation order. It was soldiers looking at what was happening and deciding to act. That decision, repeated by multiple destroyer captains along the Omaha sector, began to turn the tide. And as the morning wore on, as American soldiers started finding gaps in the defensive line and climbing the bluffs above the beach, The men in those bunkers began to understand what Pluscat had understood 3 hours earlier. The wall was already lost. The call had already been made, and nobody had believed it. Part 4. The words that came too late. By mid-morning on June 6th, 3 separate failures were running in parallel through the German command structure. Not failures of individual courage, not failures of tactical skill, systemic failures, the kind that cannot be fixed in the middle of a battle because they were built into the architecture of the system long before the battle began. The first failure was the Panzers. The 21st Panzer Division finally received authorization to move toward the coast sometime around mid-morning, hours after the window Rommel had identified had closed. By then, Allied fighter bombers owned the sky above every road in Normandy. The Luftwaffe, which Goering had personally guaranteed would provide effective air support for any invasion response, flew exactly 319 sorties over all of Normandy on June 6, 1944. The Allied air forces flew approximately 14,674. That is a ratio of roughly 46 to 1. Not a gap, a chasm. Every vehicle column on every open road in Normandy was a target. Every bridge, every crossroads, every open field was covered by Allied aircraft that the German Air Force could not challenge. The 21st Panzer did move. It eventually reached the coast sector near Caen and achieved a brief, dramatic breakthrough between the British Sword Beach and the Canadian Juno Beach, a corridor that briefly threatened to split the Allied beachhead. For a few hours, this looked like exactly the kind of concentrated armored counterattack that Rommel had envisioned. Then it was hit from the air, hit from the sea, and found itself without infantry support, without fuel reserves, and with no follow-on force behind it. The one German counterattack of D-Day demonstrated, definitively and expensively, exactly what Rommel had been saying for months. Without air cover, without pre-positioning, an armored response to an established beachhead was not a counterattack. It was a learning experience. The second failure was the command structure at its apex. The Strategic Panzer Reserves, Panzer Lehr Division, the 12th SS Panzer Division, formations that could have reached Normandy in time to significantly affect the battle, were not released because their release required Hitler's personal authorization, and Hitler was asleep. He was briefed sometime around noon. His initial interpretation of what he was hearing was that Normandy was the diversion operation he had always expected, and that the real attack at Calais was still forthcoming. The reserves were not released in time to matter. General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's chief of operations, told officers requesting the reserves that morning, "The Führer has not yet made a decision." 5 words. 5 words that summarize the structural contradiction at the heart of the German command system, an army that required a single man's authorization for every major decision, and that man was unavailable precisely when the decision was most urgent. The third failure was the language. All morning, German commanders had been filing reports in the precise, professional vocabulary of military communication. Heavy landings on multiple beaches. Significant Allied pressure on the coastal sector. Serious situation developing. These were the correct words. They were also, given the scale of what was actually happening, completely inadequate. There was no standard military vocabulary for the entire defensive concept we have been building for 4 years has been invalidated before noon. There was no protocol for the fleet that Major Pluscat described at 5 a.m. is still there, still growing, and we have no remaining means of stopping it. And so the reports traveled up the chain in language that allowed each receiving level to interpret them as worse than expected, but still within the range of manageable. Right up to the headquarters, still operating on assumptions that had been overtaken by reality 3 hours earlier. General Pemsel, who had said at 1:11 a.m. that this was the large-scale operation, who had been told to wait and see, who had been awake for 9 hours watching the battle he had predicted unfold exactly as he had feared, was, by mid-morning, no longer using measured professional language in his reports to Army Group B. By his own post-war account, words like irreversible and catastrophe were appearing. He was not filing routine updates. He was filing the reports of a man who had been given the correct answer early in the morning and dismissed, and who was now watching the consequences of that dismissal play out across a 50-mile front. Rommel arrived at Army Group B headquarters at La Roche-Guyon late on the evening of June 6th, having driven from Herrlingen in a staff car while the largest battle in the history of amphibious warfare was being decided without him. Different accounts record his reaction with slight variations, but the substance is consistent. He reportedly repeated the German word dumb, foolish, stupid, multiple times on the drive back. He had fought for months for a doctrine that said the first 24 hours were everything. He had not been present for those 24 hours. The word was, in the circumstances, inadequate to the reality. In the bunkers and gun positions above the beaches, the men of the 352nd Infantry Division were still fighting in the afternoon. Good soldiers, skilled and tenacious, fighting with genuine determination in a situation where the system they were part of had already decided the outcome, hours before they understood what was happening. Every position that fell left a gap nothing would fill. Every man who fell left a role nothing would replace. The 352nd would be shattered by the end of July 1944. It would never again function as a division. By late afternoon, American soldiers were taking the German bunkers from behind. The concrete that had seemed permanent at dawn was being cleared room by room, position by position. The men inside those positions, the men who had been told they stood behind the most powerful defensive barrier ever built, were discovering, fortification by fortification, what Werner Pluskat had understood at 5:15 in the morning when he stared through his binoculars and did the math that nobody in his chain of command was willing to do. The wall had already failed, not by the soldiers defending it, by the system built around them. The men in those bunkers, on both sides of the wire, deserved to be remembered by name, not by category. If your father or grandfather served in the European theater in the Second World War, American, British, Canadian, German, any of the nationalities present in Normandy, I would be honored to hear their story in the comments. What unit? What theater? What did they witness that they never quite talked about? Those accounts, kept in family letters and photographs and passed down through generations, are the part of this history that no archive can fully replace. Part 5 plus verdict. What the survivors said. By midnight on June 6th, 1944, the Allied beachhead in Normandy was secure. The cost, in a single day, had been roughly 10,000 Allied casualties, killed, wounded, and missing across 5 beaches and multiple airborne operations. On Omaha Beach alone, where the 352nd Infantry Division had made the Americans pay the highest price of any D-Day landing, U.S. Army casualties amounted to approximately 2,000 men. The 352nd itself had lost an estimated 1,200 soldiers, around 20% of its fighting strength, in that same 24 hours. These were real numbers. They should be said plainly. And in the German command posts that evening they were processed for a brief and desperate moment as evidence that the situation was not yet unrecoverable. Omaha had nearly worked as a defense if the destroyers had not improvised their suicidal approach, if the DD tanks had not sunk in the rough seas, if the 21st Panzer had been released at midnight instead of mid-morning. There were scenarios, narrow and contingent, in which June 6th could have been worse for the Allied cause. But the rest of the battle had not been like Omaha. At Utah Beach, American forces had suffered fewer than 200 casualties against a weaker static division. At Gold, Juno, and Sword, British and Canadian troops were advancing inland against defenders who lacked the 352nd strength. The Allied airborne divisions, despite their chaotic and scattered drops, were operating across a wide enough front to disrupt every German movement through the Norman countryside. And the fleet that Pluskat had described as 10,000 ships and been asked if he was drunk, was still there. It had not gone home. It was still unloading men and equipment onto the beaches, wave by wave, hour by hour, with no German force capable of interrupting it. Here is the forensic verdict on the morning of June 6, 1944, as seen from the bunkers. Germany's defeat at D-Day was not primarily a failure of soldiers. The men of the 352nd Infantry Division fought with skill and genuine ferocity. The defense of Omaha Beach in its first 2 hours was, by any tactical measure, successful. The machine gunners in the concrete pillboxes, The artillerymen like Pluscat, who fired their guns until the ammunition ran out, the grenadiers who held their positions against the first waves of the most powerful amphibious force in history, these men did not lose the battle. They were participants in a battle whose outcome had already been decided by the system built around them. Germany's defeat was a failure of systems. The intelligence apparatus that had processed Operation Fortitude so completely that it could not receive contradictory information even when that information arrived in the form of 7,000 ships. The command system that required a sleeping dictator's personal authorization to move armored reserves. The meteorological service that turned a weather forecast into a strategic blind spot. The chain of command in which wait and see was the answer to this is the large-scale operation at 1:11 in the morning. Every one of those failures expressed itself as language, as words spoken and not believed, as precise military reports traveling through a system that had been built to hear only one answer, as a duty officer asking if the man describing the largest naval force in recorded history had been drinking. Look at the documented record. At 1:11 a.m., Pemsel said, "This is the large-scale operation." He was told to wait. At approximately 5 a.m., Pluscat said, "There must be 10,000 ships. They are heading straight for me." He was told to get hold of himself. At noon, with all 5 beaches established and the 21st Panzer's counterattack already failing, Jodl said, "The Führer has not yet made a decision." 3 moments, 3 levels of command, 3 instances of the same failure. The evidence existed, the words were spoken correctly, and the system could not act on what the words required. In 1958 and 1959, Cornelius Ryan spent 2 years tracking down participants from both sides of the Normandy campaign. He interviewed over 700 men. He found Werner Pluscat, and he sat with him and reconstructed, hour by hour, what had happened at WN62 on June 6th. Ryan's account of Pluscat's internal experience, not just the tactical events, but what those events felt like from inside a concrete bunker watching them unfold, remains one of the most precise human documents of the entire campaign. The detail Ryan kept returning to was simple. In those first few seconds of looking at the fleet, before he reached for the telephone, before he spoke a word, Pluscat knew, calmly and surely, not a guess, not a panic, a recognition. The professional soldier doing the arithmetic of what he could see. He knew it was the end for Germany. He knew before he made a single call. He knew before the first American landing craft dropped its ramp. He knew at the moment the system he was part of was most completely, structurally incapable of knowing. Werner Pluscat survived the war. He surrendered to U.S. forces at Magdeburg on April 23, 1945, together with General Lieutenant Kurt Dittmar. He later served as one of the military consultants for the 1962 film The Longest Day, the Hollywood adaptation of Ryan's book, with a cast that included John Wayne, Robert Mitchum, and Henry Fonda, and a production that Ryan himself supervised for historical accuracy. In a French television interview in 1964, standing at the bluff above the beach on the 20th anniversary of D-Day, Pluscat stated clearly that he had been the first German officer to see the Allied fleet approach. He lived until June 11, 2002. He was 89 years old. He had 58 years to think about that phone call. The answer to the question in the title of this video, "What did German soldiers say watching D-Day begin from their bunkers?" is this. They said the right things. Pluscat said there were 10,000 ships heading straight for him. Pemsel said this was the large-scale operation. Marx drove through the night, arrived at his command post, and started issuing orders at the speed the situation required. The soldiers in the concrete emplacements above Omaha did exactly what they had been trained to do, and did it well enough that for 2 hours the outcome was genuinely in doubt. None of it was enough, not because the words were wrong, because the system built to receive those words had decided, years before the ships appeared on the horizon, what the answer was allowed to be. D-Day was not won on the beaches. It was won in the years of deception that preceded it, in the operation that convinced Germany's entire intelligence apparatus that Calais was inevitable, in the gap between what Germany told its soldiers about the Atlantic Wall and what those soldiers could see with their own eyes. in the command structure that required a single sleeping man's permission for every critical decision, in the logic that turned a genuine invasion warning signal at the time Germany's 150. It helps this channel reach the viewers who care about getting the history right, not just the version that was written down by the people who had the authority to write it. Subscribe if you want the next chapter in this audit of the Second World War, because the distance between what soldiers could see and what their commanders chose to believe is one of the defining patterns of the entire conflict. And it did not begin or end at Normandy. The men in those bunkers had names. They saw clearly, and they deserve to be remembered for that.